Okay, well, welcome everybody to this Applicant Day in Film and Media. My name is Sean Campbell. I'm a reader in media and culture at Anglia Ruskin University, and I'm going to be presenting a very short talk today entitled Listening to Media, the Importance of Sound. Now, the talk will be divided into two very short parts. Firstly, I'm going to offer some general thoughts on the role and function of sound in media. And secondly, I'm going to offer a brief exploration of the ways in which music, I think, helps to make meaning in moving image media texts. So the first thing to say, I think, is that sound is really, really key to our consumption of media, and yet it's often been overlooked, actually, in the discipline of media studies, which has been primarily focused on the visual. But if you think about our consumption of media text in the contemporary world, many of them are based around sound and listening and hearing. So if you think about the whole range of auditory technologies that we use in our consumption of media, they might include, let's say, mobile phones or MP3 players, or even the recent resurgence of vinyl. We know, for example, that sales of vinyl records have now eclipsed those of compact discs. And it seems to me that people one of the key ways in which people are consuming media is through mediums such as vinyl and the act of listening. If we think even more broadly than that, we might want to consider the ways in which music and sound are used not only in films and television programs, but also, of course, in things like games, where music plays a very, very important dramatic and narrative function in signaling where we are in the narrative, and that's a point we'll return to later in this talk. Even more broadly than that, we could possibly think about the role of sound and music in our everyday lives. The theorist Anahid Kasabian uses this term ubiquitous music, which is here on the slide, to refer to the fact that the vast majority of music that we encounter in our lives is music that is not of our choosing. It's music that we encounter or experience on the street, from people's cars, or in cafes or bars, or even in retail outlets where music is used that isn't of our choosing. And so music is very much part of the fabric of our everyday life. And yet media studies somehow hasn't really paid full attention to that. So one of the things I'm going to be arguing today is that I think that sound plays a really important role in the production of meaning in moving image media texts. And I think that it might be fair to say that meaning is produced in films and television programs through the conjunction, through the coming together of the auditory, what we hear, and the ocular, what we see. But in fact, I think it's also true that sometimes sound plays an even more important role than the visual in these cases. So if you think of the really, really obvious and very well-known example of Steven Spielberg's film Jaws, if you think of that famous scene where we hear John Williams's celebrated low-register, two-note musical motif, it's clear in that moment that what we see, which is people happily playing on a beach, swimming, and so on and so forth, we don't trust what we see. We trust what we hear. And that's despite the fact that film is, of course, primarily a visual medium, and that Western culture arguably privileges what we see over what we hear. And yet in that moment, I think we trust our ears more than our eyes. And so I think for that reason, it's very, very important that we pay attention to the role of sound in media. Now, how might we do this? Well, one way we could perhaps do this is to try and historicize the place of sound in media. And I suppose a really obvious way of doing that would be to look at the introduction of sound into cinema. Now, many of you will know that that early period of cinema, from let's say the mid-1890s to the late 1920s, is often characterized as a silent cinema. And I think that term is perhaps slightly misleading, in that although the films themselves were silent, the cinemas were actually full of sound. So very often cinemas would employ orchestras or piano players, or even they'd used what would have been called at the time a gramophone, a sort of precursor to a record player. And these would have provided musical accompaniments to the films. And they would have had a role in creating the meaning of those films. And indeed, one of the problems of that model of musical accompaniment to cinema was that the films could often mean different things in different contexts, depending on what kind of music was being played. And in the end, Hollywood had to respond to that by producing what was called a cue sheet, which would be sent out with the films around the world so that each local cinema in different parts of the world had a sort of direction on what sort of music they could play. Now, another way we might think about making sense of the role of sound in moving image media texts is through a set of critical terms that Simon Frith uses in his very, very good book, Performing Rights. And in that book, there's a really great section on the role of sound and music in moving image media texts in films and in television programs. And what Frith suggests there is that we should divide up the sort of role of sound and music into three different categories. And he calls these the emotional code, the cultural code, and the dramatic code. And very briefly, what he's saying there is that we might think firstly about the way in which music has an emotional function in film and television. And that emotional function might work in a couple of different ways. For example, it might be used to sort of encourage the audience to approach the film or TV program in a certain way. It might give them a clue as to sort of the emotional contours or the tone of that media text. But also the music might be used to tell us something about where the characters are at, what they're feeling, and give us a sense of their emotional condition. The second code that Frith identifies is the cultural code, which I think is really interesting. This is where music is used to place a film in space and time. So it's used to place a film geographically and also historically. So you might, for example, think about the fact that, let's say, films set in Britain in the early 1970s often used glam rock as a kind of shorthand for where we are. Or you might want to think about the way in which a television series such as Stranger Things uses a certain type of music from the 1980s to very much locate that series in time. And then the third and final code that Frith identifies is what he calls the dramatic code, which is music that tells us where we are in the narrative. So this is music that might be used to sort of slow down the action, perhaps in the middle of the film, or it may be music that's used to underline closure or resolution of the narrative, perhaps towards the end of a film or a television program. So these are some of the ways in which we might like to think about the role of sound and music in moving image media texts. And I hope that's been somewhat interesting and useful. And thank you very much for watching and also for listening.